Have you ever stopped to think about how the invisible walls we build in our minds end up becoming the very real concrete walls that divide our cities? Today, we're going to dive deep into a fascinating academic study on urban segregation, and we'll be using the Turkish city of Adana as our case study, as a magnifying glass, to get a closer look at a global issue that, well, it might just be reshaping your own community as we speak.
This, right here, this single, startling question from a wealthy Adana resident says it all, doesn't it? It just blows the whole thing wide open. It lays bare a worldview where the poor aren't seen as neighbors, but as a completely separate, almost invisible, but necessary service class. This is the invisible boundary we're about to unpack.
So here's our roadmap for this exploration. We're going to start with the paradox of the modern city itself. Then we'll get into the theoretical tools we need to really understand segregation. From there, we'll take a journey to Adana to see these theories in action, look at some really stark data, and then finally, we'll see how this one city's story echoes across the entire globe.
Okay, let's kick things off with a paradox. You know, historically, cities were places of promise, of freedom. There's that old German saying, city air makes you free. But look around today. For so many, cities have become these landscapes of deep division and inequality. So how on earth did that promise get so broken?
Well, in Turkey, just like in so many other parts of the world, the neoliberal policies that kicked in around the 1980s, the ones that championed free markets and privatization, they did a lot more than just create a wealth gap. They actually fractured the very fabric of society. This led to a process of othering, where the poor living on the urban periphery, in what's called the Varosh, were systematically reimagined by the elite not as fellow citizens, but as a source of danger and chaos.
To really get under the hood of how this othering translates into actual physical separation, we need a solid theoretical toolkit. So let's look at the key thinkers who help us understand the mechanics of this psychological and ultimately spatial divide.
Okay, so on one hand, you have George Simmel. He argued that to survive the constant bombardment of city life, we develop what he called a blasé attitude. It's a kind of psychological numbness, a shield. This leads to social indifference, where we start to see other people as objects, not subjects. Then Henri Lefebvre shows us how this internal indifference becomes our external reality. He said space isn't just an empty box, it's actively produced. The dominant class, armed with that Simmelian indifference, literally builds its ideology into the city's blueprint, creating the very walls and gates that enforce that social distance.
And then Max Weber adds another crucial layer here, with his idea of mental universes. What he's saying is that even when people are living right next to each other, different social classes can inhabit completely separate worlds. They don't share the same values, the same meanings. They might share a postal code, but they do not share a reality. These are the invisible walls we're talking about.
And finally, Teresa Caldera gives us the modern architectural expression of all this theory, the fortified enclave. We all know what these look like. They're not just neighborhoods. They are private, secured bubbles designed specifically to fragment the public sphere and keep everyone else out. The walls are, quite literally, fear made manifest in concrete and steel.
So, now that we have our theoretical framework locked in, let's see how all these powerful ideas actually play out on the ground. We're heading to our real-world laboratory, the city of Adana in southern Turkey.
So, why Adana? Well, back in the early 2000s, it had the second highest income inequality in all of Turkey, just behind Istanbul. This makes it the perfect and, frankly, a surprisingly overlooked place to study how extreme economic disparity physically shapes a city.
Now, this study was incredibly precise, because if you want to understand the elite mindset, you first have to define who exactly the elite are. The researchers targeted the top 8.4% of society using really strict criteria: an income at least 10 times the minimum wage, property and vehicle ownership, and a high-level professional status. This methodological rigor is what gives the findings we're about to see so much weight.
And now for the evidence, the numbers that came out of this study. Well, they paint a really stark and pretty unsettling picture of the mental and social divides running through Adana.
Get this, a staggering 65.2% of the wealthy participants defined poverty in purely financial terms. For them, a poor person is just a number, someone who's just surviving on minimum wage. This is a perfect, real-world example of Simmel's blasé attitude in action. The human experience, the systemic nature of poverty, it's all erased. The poor are reduced to a simple, cold statistic. But, what people say in surveys and what they actually believe can be two very different things. The researchers here were smart. They designed the study to peel back that layer of socially acceptable answers to get at the raw, underlying fears that genuinely drive people's behavior.
And here's what they found. An incredible 84% of the wealthy demand private security on their streets. But even more shocking, 50%, fully half of them, admitted they would respond to violence from a poor person with violence of their own. This shows us that this segregation isn't passive. It's an active, defensive stance. It is a psychological preparation for class conflict.
And this withdrawal from public life plays out in everyday choices. Over 71% prefer sterile, private shopping malls to public markets. Nearly 43% use private schools. And more than half, 57%, admit they'd actually be disturbed by having a poor neighbor. Step by step, they are carving out a dual city where the wealthy systematically abandon any kind of shared life, which erases the very possibility of developing social empathy. So let's zoom out for a second, because the story of Adana is not some isolated event. In fact, it has profound and direct echoes with urban dynamics that are very familiar in Italy. The kind of social exclusion we see in Adana's Varoş is a direct parallel to the dynamics of Italy's periferia, and that fear-driven retreat into fortified enclaves, it's sociologically identical to the Italian concept of paura urbana, urban fear. The names and the languages are different, but the social engine driving it is precisely the same. And this brings us to our final and most important point. Adana is more than just one city's story. It's a microcosm. It's a laboratory for understanding the urban trends that are unfolding right now across the global south, and frankly, beyond. This really helps to visualize the divide. Imagine a heat map of Adana. The north, where the wealthy live, it glows a kind of cool, sterile green. The south, the Varoş, burns a dense, chaotic red. And slicing right between them is the Seyhan River. It's not just a river anymore. It's become a hard, physical border between two completely separate realities.
So what's the big takeaway here? The Adana case study gives us a predictive model for how sustained, deep inequality can physically and socially tear our cities apart. It stands as a critical warning, and it's an incredibly important contribution to global urban theory, offering a fresh perspective from the global south that really challenges and enriches the existing literature.
And that leaves us with one final, crucial question. We've used this entire framework to decode what's happening in Adana, but these patterns of fear, indifference, and withdrawal are universal. So the question I leave you with is this. Can you now see the invisible boundaries being built in your own city?